The aroma of bread baking in the oven filled the small kitchen, blending with the girls' laughter. Susan and Amber were stacking plates for breakfast, while Lucy, only 2 years old, swung her little legs in her high chair, murmuring incomprehensible words. "Careful, Amber, you're going to break the plate," said Susan with her typical older sister responsibility. "No, I won't," Amber replied with a mischievous laugh, balancing a plate on her fingertips. In the background, Sarah observed the scene as she prepared the coffee. Her eyes sparkled with unmistakable love. She always said that the noise of her family was her favorite music. Alan entered the kitchen, drying his hands with a towel, and paused for a moment to admire the scene. "Looks like everything is under control here," he said, approaching to kiss Sarah's forehead. "For now," she replied with a smile. "But I give you 5 minutes before Lucy throws her spoon on the floor." Alan laughed, picking up the little one and spinning her in the air, eliciting giggles from the youngest daughter. It was a typical morning in Alan and Sarah's household, but these ordinary moments were everything to them. A few weeks later, the laughter was replaced by silent worries. Sarah began to feel constantly tired. At first, she thought it was just the pace of routine, but Alan insisted she see a doctor. When the diagnosis came, it was like a punch in the gut. The illness was terminal, progressing too quickly for any hope of a cure. The initial shock was hard to bear, but Sarah made a decision. She didn't want the remaining months to be defined by her illness. "Alan, I want the girls to remember me as I was," she said one evening while they were sitting in the living room after the children had gone to bed. "Promise me you'll keep them together. That you'll remind them every day how much I love them." Alan held her hand firmly. "I promise, Sarah. I'll do everything to make sure they never feel alone." And so, even while facing her own pain, Sarah dedicated her last months to creating memories for the family. She organized backyard picnics, captured happy moments with her camera, and helped Susan and Amber write letters for Lucy to read when she grew up. On the day of the funeral, the sky was gray and heavy. Alan held Lucy in his arms, feeling the weight of silence. Susan stood by his side, her face serious as she held Amber's hand, who was trying to hold back tears. Little Lucy, still too young to understand the gravity of the situation, whispered, "Is Mommy coming home after this?" Alan pressed his lips together, feeling the lump in his throat tighten even more. "No, sweetheart," he said, his voice breaking. "Mommy has gone to a very special place. But she'll always be with us." As the coffin was lowered, Susan squeezed her father's hand. "You don't have to be strong alone, Dad," she said with the maturity of someone far beyond her 17 years. "We're together." Those words were like a beacon for Alan. He knew he had to move forward for them, but realizing Susan was willing to share some of the burden was a small relief amidst the overwhelming grief. The weeks that followed were a challenge. The void left by Sarah was almost tangible. Amber tried to help as much as she could, entertaining Lucy with games and stories, while Susan took on an almost maternal role, helping with household chores. Alan did his best to maintain routine, but there were moments when the sadness was unbearable. One particularly difficult evening, Alan sat on the sofa, looking at an old photo of Sarah. Susan sat next to him in silence before placing her hand on his shoulder. "I miss her so much," he said, finally letting the tears fall. "I do too," Susan replied, her eyes brimming with tears. "But she would never want us to stop living. Let's make her proud, Dad." Alan nodded, wiping his face. Susan was right. He couldn't drown in his sorrow. Sarah had entrusted him with caring for the girls, and he would do so, even if he had to face seemingly insurmountable challenges. 2 years had passed since Sarah's death, and Alan's life had become a constant battle. He still lived in the modest house where he had created so many memories with his wife, but her absence was felt in every corner. The kitchen table, once a hub of laughter and conversations, was now covered with stacks of overdue bills and notes from temporary jobs. The laughter of his daughters still existed but was rarer and less carefree. At 17 years old, Susan had taken on a much larger role than she should for her age. She worked at a bakery in the mornings, attended school in the afternoons, and still tried to help her father at home. Amber, now 14, had become Lucy's caregiver, the youngest having just turned 4. Despite her youth, Amber did her best to ensure the little one didn't feel the weight of their new reality. That morning, Alan was seated at the table with a cup of cold coffee in his hands, staring at a newspaper covered in pen marks. He circled the few job ads that seemed promising, but he knew the chances were slim. Since losing his stable job at the mechanic shop, he survived on odd jobs as a plumber and electrician. The money barely covered the bills, and he relied on Susan's wages to keep the household running. Lucy ran into the kitchen, followed by Amber. The youngest was clutching a scribbled piece of paper as if it were a precious treasure. "Daddy, look what I drew," Lucy said, holding the paper up to him. The drawing showed 4 figures, one larger, clearly Alan, and 3 smaller ones representing his daughters. Alan smiled, feeling a pang in his chest. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. I'll put it on the fridge, okay?" Lucy nodded while Amber leaned against the doorframe. "Do you have any work today, Dad?" she asked, trying to sound casual but with evident concern in her voice. "Not yet," Alan sighed. "But I'm waiting for some calls." Amber didn't respond, but the look she exchanged with him said everything. She understood more than she should for her age. Later, as Susan was getting ready to leave for work, she approached her father with an envelope in hand. "Dad, use this to pay the electricity bill," she said, handing him part of her salary. Alan shook his head. "Susan, no. That money is yours. You need to save it for yourself." "Dad," she insisted, with a firmness that reminded him of Sarah. "I don't need much. Just a new backpack for school, and that can wait." Alan looked at his daughter, feeling a mix of pride and sadness. "Thank you, my love. I promise I'll find a way. We won't need this for much longer." Susan smiled, but he knew she was sacrificing more than she should. That afternoon, while Alan was cleaning tools in the backyard, his phone rang. He answered quickly, hoping it was a job offer. "Alan? This is Peter, from the shop. Remember me?" "Of course, Peter. How are you?" "I'm good, good. Listen, I recommended you for a job at a lady's house in Westwood. It's a simple plumbing repair, but it pays well. She's a bit demanding, but I think you can handle it." Alan didn't hesitate. "Thanks, Peter. I'll take it." "Great. I'll send you the address. The housekeeper will meet you there tomorrow morning." The next morning, Alan woke up early, putting on his old work shirt and grabbing his toolbox. Susan was already heading out for work, and Amber was helping Lucy get dressed. "Are you working today, Dad?" Lucy asked, her eyes shining with curiosity. "Yes, sweetheart. It's an important job," he said, kissing her forehead. "Be good, okay?" Amber nodded, and Susan gave him an encouraging look before leaving. "Good luck, Dad." Alan drove to Westwood, a neighborhood very different from the modest one he lived in. The streets were wide and clean, lined with perfectly trimmed trees. The mansion he was sent to was imposing, with high gates and a garden that looked like it belonged in a magazine. He was greeted by Margot, the housekeeper, a warm middle-aged woman who led him to the repair site. "It's a simple plumbing issue in the master suite bathroom," she explained. "Mrs. Beaumont wants everything perfect." "Understood," Alan said, opening his toolbox. As he worked, Alan couldn't help but notice the luxury around him. Expensive rugs covered the floors, and the walls were adorned with paintings that probably cost more than his entire house. He focused on the task, but his mind wandered to the bills at home and how much this payment would help. As he finished the repair, he heard an authoritative voice behind him. "Margot, have you put that box away in the basement?" Alan turned to see a tall, elegant woman entering the suite. It was Evelyn Beaumont, the mansion's owner. She glanced at him briefly before looking away, as if he were part of the furniture. "I'm taking care of it now, ma'am," Margot replied. Evelyn handed Margot a box filled with papers and old items. "Make sure it stays out of the way," she said before leaving the room. Margot sighed, looking at Alan with a faint smile. Rich people have an interesting way of seeing the world. Alan just smiled back, not imagining that box would change his life forever. As Alan finished organizing his tools, he heard the sound of footsteps echoing in the basement. Margot, the housekeeper, seemed to be muttering as she carried the box Evelyn had handed her. He tried to ignore it, but something about Margot's expression as she passed him caught his attention. These people, they never appreciate the simple things. Junk? This is history, not garbage, Margot murmured as she descended the stairs. Curiosity began to gnaw at Alan, but he focused on his work. Once he had completed the repair in the bathroom suite, he went downstairs to let Margot know the job was done. He found her in the basement, standing in front of a table with the box open and its contents spread out. The dim basement light illuminated black and white photos, carefully folded letters, and small items that looked like they belonged to another era. There was a vintage camera, similar to one Sarah used to own, and a photo album with a worn cover. "Job's done," Alan announced, but his voice faded as he noticed a photo on the top of the pile. The image seemed familiar in an unsettling way. Margot, noticing his gaze, sighed and shook her head. She wanted to throw this away, she said, pointing to the items. These are family memories. But apparently, they have no place in this mansion. Alan hesitated, trying to sound casual. "Looks old," he said, his voice uncertain. He slowly approached, his eyes fixed on an open album on the table. Margot flipped through a few pages, stopping at a specific photo. "Look at this," she said, pointing. "This is Mrs. Beaumont, a long time ago, with her daughter." Alan froze. In the photo, Evelyn Beaumont held a baby in her arms, but what left him speechless was the woman. She was identical to Sarah. For a moment, he thought he was looking at an image of his wife. "Who is this child?" Alan asked, his voice faltering. Margot sighed deeply, as if the weight of the story was too much to bear. "That's Emily, Mrs. Beaumont's daughter. She disappeared when she was just a baby. It was a huge scandal at the time. The police investigated but never found anything." The revelation left Alan shaken. He tried to process what he had just heard, but his mind was in turmoil. Acting quickly, he took his phone from his pocket and discreetly snapped a photo of the album page. "Are you all right?" Margot asked, noticing his change in expression. "Yes, just curious," Alan lied, trying to sound nonchalant. He thanked the housekeeper, grabbed his toolbox, and left the mansion. On the drive home, Alan felt his chest tighten. The resemblance between Evelyn Beaumont and Sarah was undeniable, and the details about the missing daughter made the coincidences even harder to ignore. He parked in front of his house but sat in the car for a few minutes, staring at the photo on his phone. The question that kept spinning in his mind was clear: how could Sarah be connected to this woman? Back in the kitchen, Susan was finishing setting the table for dinner while Amber helped Lucy with the silverware. The familiar noise of his daughters brought Alan back to reality, but he couldn't shake the thoughts from his head. "Dad, you're acting strange," Susan said, giving him a curious look. "Did something happen at work?" Alan hesitated, looking at his 3 daughters, and felt a weight in his heart. He didn't want to worry them until he was sure of his suspicions. "Nothing much," he replied, forcing a smile. "It was just a long day." Susan didn't seem convinced but decided not to press. Amber, on the other hand, noticed her father's thoughtful expression and asked, "Will you go back to that house again?" "Maybe," Alan replied, sitting down in a chair. "Depends on the job." Later that night, after the girls were asleep, Alan sat at the table with his phone in hand. He enlarged the photo of the album page, examining every detail. Evelyn held a baby in her arms, her face the spitting image of Sarah's. What could this mean? The resemblance was impossible to ignore. He spent hours replaying the few stories Sarah had shared about her childhood. She had always been vague, saying only that she grew up in foster care and that her biological parents were never mentioned. There were gaps he had never thought to question, but now everything seemed like a piece of a larger puzzle. Alan couldn't sleep after discovering the photo at the mansion. The image of Evelyn Beaumont holding a baby identical to his late wife Sarah lingered in his mind like a shadow. He knew he needed answers, but the thought of confronting someone so powerful made him anxious. The next morning, while Susan was at work and Amber cared for Lucy, Alan locked himself in his room with old photo albums and documents Sarah had kept. Alan carefully flipped through every page of the family albums, searching for anything that might confirm or refute his suspicions. Most of the photos showed Sarah as he had always known her, smiling, with her camera in hand, capturing precious moments with their children. However, there was nothing about her childhood. It was as if her life had started the moment she met him. He also recalled the few times Sarah had mentioned her upbringing. She had said she grew up in foster care and that her biological parents had never been part of her life. At the time, Alan hadn't questioned it. He knew it was a sensitive topic for her and had respected her privacy. As he searched, one question hammered in his mind: why had Sarah never sought her biological family? Did she know there was more to her story? With the little information he had, though sparse, Alan decided to return to the mansion. He needed to confront Evelyn directly. When he arrived, he was again greeted by Margot, who seemed surprised to see him. "Did you forget something?" Margot asked. "I need to speak with Mrs. Beaumont." "It's urgent," Alan replied, his determination evident. Margot hesitated but eventually led him to the living room. Evelyn was sitting on a luxurious sofa, flipping through a magazine. When she saw him, she raised an eyebrow, clearly irritated. "You again?" Evelyn asked coldly. "Margot, I didn't ask to receive anyone." "Apologies, ma'am," Margot said, bowing her head before leaving the room. Alan took a few steps forward, holding his phone with the photo of the album page displayed. "I need to speak with you. It's about your daughter." Evelyn froze. For a brief moment, her hardened expression gave way to something more vulnerable, but she quickly regained her composure. "If you think you can walk into my house and manipulate me with stories about Emily, you are sorely mistaken," she said, her voice cutting. Alan took a deep breath. "I'm not trying to deceive anyone. But when I saw this photo," he showed her the phone. "I couldn't ignore the resemblance. My wife, Sarah, was identical to you. And my wife grew up in foster care." Evelyn was silent for a long moment, staring at the photo. Finally, she stood and walked to the window. "You think you can just show up here with an absurd theory and expect me to believe it?" "I don't know what to think," Alan admitted. "But my wife is gone, and these are the only clues I have. If there's even a chance Sarah was your daughter, I need to know. Not for me, but for my daughters." Evelyn turned to him, her eyes blazing with anger and pain. "Get out of my house. Now." Alan stood still, but before he could say anything more, Margot appeared at the door. "Sir," she said gently, "perhaps it's best if you leave." Reluctantly, Alan took his phone and left, feeling defeated. He didn't see the moment Evelyn collapsed onto the sofa, covering her face with her hands. Alone in the living room, Evelyn was consumed by memories she had avoided for years. Emily had disappeared when she was just over a year old. Evelyn could still remember the last time she held her in her arms before placing her in the crib that night. When she woke up, the baby was gone. The police had investigated, suspecting a kidnapping, but never found concrete evidence. The pain and guilt had eaten away at Evelyn for years, but she eventually buried it all under a facade of coldness and control. As she reflected, Evelyn remembered something. Emily had a hereditary medical condition, a heart anomaly that ran in her family. She wondered, with a heavy heart, if the woman Alan described had inherited this condition. When Alan was about to get into his car, he heard Evelyn's voice calling him. He turned, surprised to see her standing at the mansion's entrance. "Wait," Evelyn said, her voice less severe. "Come back. I want to hear more about your wife." Back in the living room, Evelyn asked Margot to serve tea before sitting across from Alan. "You said your wife's name was Sarah. Tell me more about her." Alan recounted how he met Sarah, the life they built together, and the illness that took her from him. When he mentioned Sarah's terminal diagnosis, Evelyn furrowed her brow. What was her condition? Evelyn asked cautiously. A rare type of heart degeneration, Alan replied. The doctors said it could be hereditary, but Sarah never knew much about her biological parents. Evelyn placed her hand on her chest, clearly shaken. That runs in my family, she murmured. Alan seized the moment. I'm not here for money, Mrs. Beaumont. My daughters lost their mother. If there's a chance they still have a grandmother, I need to know. Evelyn was silent for a long time before finally saying, I want to find out if this is true. I'll need proof. But for now, I don't want anyone to know about this. Understood? Alan nodded, feeling they had taken a small step toward the truth. The atmosphere was tense, but the purpose was clear. Evelyn Beaumont, for the first time in decades, allowed herself to delve into her past in search of answers she both feared and longed for. Beside her, Alan felt somewhat out of place but determined. This was more than an investigation for him, it was a chance to give his daughters something he could never provide on his own, a connection to their mother and her roots. Evelyn and Alan sat in the mansion's living room while Margot placed a small stack of documents on the table. These had been found in the attic and included old certificates, diary notes, and a faded photo of Evelyn holding Emily. These papers are the only records we still have, Margot explained gently. The rest has been lost over the years. Evelyn examined the documents, her fingers trembling slightly. Emily disappeared on a stormy night. I remember every detail of that day as if it were etched in my mind, she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. The police found signs that someone had entered the house, but there were no tracks. It was as if she had simply vanished. Alan listened intently, trying to imagine what Evelyn must have felt at the time. Finally, he gathered the courage to speak. Sarah grew up in foster care, he said. She didn't talk much about it, but maybe the orphanage where she was registered could give us more clues. Evelyn hesitated but nodded. That's a good starting point. I want to go with you. The next morning, Alan and Evelyn traveled together to the orphanage where Sarah had been registered. The place was a modest building surrounded by old trees. Upon entering, the sound of children's laughter greeted them, but Evelyn seemed lost in thought. They were greeted by Clara, an administrative assistant, who, after hearing the purpose of their visit, led them to the orphanage's historical records. We have old records, but some have been damaged over time, Clara explained, guiding them to a room filled with boxes. While Clara searched, Evelyn looked around. The walls were decorated with photos of happy children and events held over the years. She approached a black and white image of a group of children holding hands. Do you think Sarah had a happy childhood here? Evelyn asked softly, almost to herself. She never complained, Alan replied, stepping closer. Sarah was always very grateful for everything. But there were moments when I saw a sadness she tried to hide. I think she wondered who her biological parents were and why she was left here. Clara returned with a folder in hand. This is Sarah's file, she said, placing it on the table. Alan and Evelyn leaned over the papers. Among the documents was a note about Sarah's adoption. The names of her adoptive parents were listed, but the most intriguing detail was a handwritten observation, origin unknown, delivered to the orphanage by third parties. Evelyn felt the weight of the words. Does this mean they never discovered how she got here? Clara nodded. It seems she was brought in by someone who didn't identify themselves. It was common at the time, unfortunately. Although the information was frustrating, Evelyn felt a little closer to Sarah. There was something tangible, albeit incomplete. She looked at Alan, who appeared equally contemplative. May I ask you for something? Evelyn asked hesitantly. I'd like to visit her grave. I need to say goodbye to the daughter I lost before I even knew her. At the cemetery, Evelyn remained silent for a long time in front of Sarah's simple gravestone. She brought her hands to her chest, as if trying to contain the wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Sarah, she began, her voice trembling, I failed you. I wasn't there when you needed me most. I didn't protect you. But, you had a good life, didn't you? Alan, standing beside her, looked at the gravestone with a melancholy gaze. She was incredible. Sarah had a huge heart. She made the world feel lighter. She loved our family in a way that seemed infinite. Evelyn smiled, but tears streamed freely down her face. Thank you, Alan, she said, turning to him. Thank you for giving her what I couldn't. For being the man she deserved. Alan shook his head. I just hope I did enough. She was the best part of our lives. They stayed there for some time, the silence filled only by the sound of the wind. For Evelyn, it was both a farewell and a reunion with the part of herself she had lost. For Alan, it was a reaffirmation of everything Sarah had meant and an unexpected connection to someone he never thought would stand by his side. Back at the mansion, Evelyn was more determined than ever to uncover the truth about Sarah. The stories Alan shared about her life and the moment at her grave had deeply moved her. The need to fill the gaps in decades of uncertainty drove her forward. Margot met them at the entrance, her expression curious. Any news from the orphanage, she asked as she guided them to the library, where they had set up a small station to review the old documents. Very little, Alan replied with a tired tone. But not enough to prove anything. Evelyn sighed. We need to keep searching. Margot, you mentioned there were more boxes in the attic, right? Perhaps we should review everything. Margot nodded. I'll fetch what's left. It might take some time. While Margot climbed the stairs, Alan used the opportunity to organize the information they had so far. He opened a folder containing the orphanage notes, photos of Sarah, and anything that could help connect the dots. Evelyn observed from a distance, surprised by his determination. You're a methodical man, she remarked. Alan shrugged. It's the least I can do for Sarah. And for my daughters. I see so much of Emily in you, Evelyn said almost to herself, as if trying to understand how this man had entered her daughter's life without her knowing. Before Alan could respond, Margot returned with a large, dusty box. This was at the very back of the attic, she said, placing the box on the table. It's from when Emily was born. I hope it helps. Evelyn opened the box carefully, as though touching a piece of her own history. Inside were more old photographs, letters exchanged between her and Emily's father, in a notebook. At the bottom of the notebook was something that made Evelyn gasp, a locket she had given Emily as a baby, with the name Emily engraved on the back. I thought this had disappeared with her, Evelyn said, holding the object as though it were a lost treasure. She handed it to Alan, her eyes misty. Sarah, did she still have this? Alan shook his head. I never saw anything like it with her. But that doesn't mean she didn't keep it. As they sifted through the documents, Alan found something that seemed significant, a letter written by Sarah's adoptive mother. It was a short note mentioning that Sarah had been left with only a blanket embroidered with the initials EB. Evelyn sat silently, her hands trembling slightly. Those are my initials, she murmured. It's true. There's no doubt anymore. While Evelyn processed the discovery, Alan returned home with a mix of relief and sadness. He knew they were close to having all the answers, but he also felt the weight of Evelyn's pain. When he arrived, he found Susan in the kitchen, helping Amber with Lucy's homework. Dad, are you okay? Susan asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. Alan hesitated for a moment but decided that Susan, as the eldest, deserved to know. Can I talk to you in private? Susan nodded, following him to the living room. Alan sat on the couch, gesturing for her to do the same. Susan, I need to tell you something, but I want you to keep it between us for now. Of course, Dad. What happened? Alan took a deep breath. I think I've found your mom's biological mother. Your grandmother. Susan's eyes widened. What? How? Are you sure? Not completely, Alan admitted. But everything is pointing in that direction. It's complicated, but she's a very wealthy, influential woman. I'm trying to confirm everything before telling your sisters. Susan was silent for a moment, processing the information. If it's true, that's amazing. I always thought it would be nice to know more about Mom's family. Alan smiled, touching her hand. You're so mature, Susan. I don't know what I'd do without you. We're in this together, Dad, she replied, squeezing his hand. And I'll help however I can. The next morning, Alan returned to the mansion to share their latest discoveries with Evelyn. Margot met them in the library, where the documents were spread out on the dark wooden table. Good morning, Alan said, placing a folder next to the papers. Evelyn, already seated with a cup of tea in her hands, kept her gaze fixed on the documents. I hope we have more than vague stories today, Evelyn murmured, still defensive but less confrontational than before. Margot, you mentioned old medical records last time, Alan said. Perhaps they could be useful. Margot nodded and quickly disappeared toward the attic. While they waited, Alan began organizing the evidence they already had, photos, orphanage records, and the document listing Emily's blood type. Evelyn looked at the photos with a mix of nostalgia and pain. She looked so much like you, Alan commented, pointing to an old photo of Evelyn as a young woman. The same determination in her eyes. Before Evelyn could respond, Margot returned with a dusty folder. I found this in one of the boxes, she said, handing it to Evelyn. Inside was a detailed medical exam of Emily, ordered by Evelyn when the baby was just a few months old. Evelyn explained that, knowing her family's medical history, she had wanted to ensure Emily hadn't inherited the heart condition that ran in their bloodline. Alan frowned, recalling the exam Sarah underwent when her first symptoms appeared. I have something that could be compared to this, he said, retrieving an envelope from his folder. He pulled out Sarah's medical records, taken decades later when she was an adult. They placed the two reports side by side on the table. The genetic markers were eerily identical. The same hereditary traits of the heart condition were present in both documents. Evelyn clasped her hands to her face, stifling a sob. There's no doubt anymore, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Sarah was Emily. She was my daughter. Alan felt a mix of relief and sadness. He had found the answer, but Evelyn's pain was palpable. Margot, sensing the weight of the moment, placed a comforting hand on her employer's shoulder. You finally have the truth, ma'am, Margot said with a gentle smile. And you still have a chance to connect with her, through the girls. Evelyn picked up the reports, holding them carefully as though they were sacred relics. She looked at Alan, her eyes brimming with tears. I want to meet them, she said, referring to her granddaughters. When the time is right, I want to be part of their lives. Alan nodded, feeling they had taken a significant step forward. I'll prepare them. I want this to be as special for them as it will be for you. That weekend, Alan's heart raced as he walked into the living room with Evelyn by his side. The girls were gathered there. Susan was trying to organize Lucy's toys while Amber was absorbed in a book. He knew this moment would be delicate but hoped it would also be meaningful. Girls, Alan began, drawing their attention. I want you to meet someone. Evelyn entered the room hesitantly. Lucy was the first to react, leaving her toys on the floor and running to hide behind Susan, who watched curiously. Who is she, Dad? Amber asked, a mix of caution and curiosity in her voice. Alan took a deep breath. This is Evelyn. She's your mother's mother. Your grandmother. The girls fell silent, processing the information. Susan was the first to stand, approaching with a shy smile. It's nice to meet you, she said, extending her hand. Evelyn accepted the handshake gently, unable to hide her emotion. The pleasure is all mine, dear, she replied, her voice slightly trembling. You remind me so much of your mother. Amber, still hesitant, stood and joined them. Are you really our grandmother? She asked, looking Evelyn up and down. Yes, dear, Evelyn replied, kneeling to her level. I only recently found out. And I'm so happy to finally meet you. Lucy, with her childlike innocence, emerged from behind Susan and slowly approached. Are you staying here forever? She asked, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Evelyn smiled, holding her tiny hand. I hope we can spend a lot of time together, little one. I'd like that very much. The initial tension began to dissipate as the girls warmed up to Evelyn. Susan, ever protective, invited Evelyn to sit on the couch and began asking questions about her life. Amber, observing from the side, started to open up, while Lucy climbed into her grandmother's lap and talked about her favorite toys. Later, over dinner, Evelyn shared stories about Sarah, or Emily, as she had known her. She spoke about how Emily had been a curious and smiling baby, and how her disappearance had left a huge void. The girls listened intently, fascinated by the parts of their mother's history they had never heard before. She was so much like you, Evelyn said, looking at each of them. Not just in appearance, but in spirit. Strong, kind, and full of life. Alan watched the scene with a quiet smile. Seeing Evelyn interact so naturally with the girls was something he hadn't expected so soon. He knew challenges lay ahead, but this moment was a promising beginning. When the night came to an end, Evelyn said goodbye to the girls with a hug for each of them, promising to return soon. Lucy, in her spontaneous way, grabbed Evelyn's hand before she left. Will you bring more stories next time? Evelyn laughed, feeling a genuine joy she hadn't experienced in years. Yes, my little one. I'll bring lots of stories. The morning sun illuminated the backyard of Alan's house, where the girls played, their laughter filling the air. Lucy ran with a balloon in her hands, while Amber helped Susan hang clothes on the line. Alan, seated on the porch, observed the scene with a calm smile. Life finally seemed to be settling into place. Since Evelyn entered their lives, everything had changed. In the months following the revelation, she insisted on helping Alan with household expenses. Though he initially resisted, Evelyn was firm. I lost a daughter, she had said during one of their conversations. But now I have 3 granddaughters and a son-in-law. I won't let you struggle alone. With her help, Alan managed to rebuild. He used the time to improve his skills and secured a stable job as a maintenance manager for a large company. Susan, with Evelyn's support, focused on her studies and began dreaming of attending university again. Meanwhile, Amber and Lucy enjoyed a lighter, more carefree childhood. Evelyn became a constant presence. She never tried to replace Sarah but brought stories, advice, and love that filled gaps no one knew existed. To the girls, she was more than a grandmother, she was a link to their mother's past and an example of strength and redemption. That morning, Evelyn arrived with a basket of fresh bread and joined Alan on the porch. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the children play. It was a silence filled with understanding. You seem lighter, Evelyn said, breaking the silence. Alan smiled, looking at her. It's because I finally feel like we're on the right path. I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for us. Evelyn shook her head, a gentle smile on her lips. You don't need to thank me, Alan. I'm the one who should thank you. You've given me something I thought I'd never have again, a family. Alan was thoughtful, watching his daughters. Sarah would have loved this. Seeing the family united. It's what she always wanted. Evelyn nodded, her eyes shining with emotion. She was right. Family is everything. I learned that the hard way, but I'm lucky to have a second chance. They sat in silence again, watching the girls run around the yard. Lucy shouted something about winning an imaginary race, and Amber picked her up, spinning her in the air. Susan laughed as the breeze moved the clothes on the line in the background. Second chances, Alan murmured, more to himself. He looked at Evelyn with a grateful smile. They're precious. Evelyn smiled back. Yes, Alan. They truly are. As the sun shone down on the house and the sound of the girls' laughter filled the air, Evelyn and Alan realized that despite everything they had lost, there was still much to gain. They didn't have all the answers, but they had something far more important, the certainty that they were together. And in that moment, everything felt exactly as it should. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.